Hello, I'm back. We have an upcycle, a corset inspired upcycle. You've probably seen them everywhere. They're very trendy right now. I am taking liberties from corsets in that it's a structured garment, but it's not an actual corset. So I want to leave a really good resource down below that I found that kind of talks about the ins and outs of corsetry in the late 1800s in men's and women's fashion. So definitely check that out if you're interested. But other than that, I'm a little bit late to the trend. I did add sleeves, so it's more seasonally appropriate. And yeah, this was a challenge for me, so designing and construction wise. So if you'd like to see how I managed to work my way through it, then just keep watching. Here is my design. It features long sleeves and a hook and eye closure down the front. To begin, I'm going to start by taping out all of my style lines. I'm using 1/4 inch painter's tape, which is great because it's sticky enough to adhere to the dress form, but it's not too sticky where it leaves a gross residue. Once all my style lines were on my dress form, I started to drape my muslin, making sure that the grain line was always perpendicular to the floor. I worked panel by panel, pinning around the edges and then tracing the middle of those tape lines for each piece. I then brought that over to my table to true up that panel a little bit, making sure to mark the grain line on this individual piece and leaving a little bit of fabric around the colored pencil lines to allow for overlapping on my dress form with all of the remaining pieces. As I said, I did go through this process one panel at a time to make sure that if I needed to make any adjustments that the errors weren't compounding across the bodice. As you can see, I'm adjusting the center seam of the bust because I wasn't happy with how it was laying, and then I recut it and moved on to do the same for all of the remaining pieces. I am attempting here to measure my desired sleeve length. I settled on 21 inches and cut a big rectangle of muslin to begin draping my sleeve. That's a burn mark, by the way, for my iron because I very intelligently left it sitting on my fabric and walked away. So this is probably Joanne muslin, meaning that the grain is really wonky and pretty crappy. So I wanted to straighten it out and make sure it was super square before heading into draping anything. And then I just began folding my sleeve together. This was my first attempt at draping a sleeve, and I'm going to leave all my resources down below to help you do the same if you have any questions, because I definitely don't have enough expertise to explain it well. Now I'm cutting the depth of the armhole to assist when I drape it on my dress form, as just a rough placement for the shape of the sleeve. And of course I had to adjust it because I arbitrarily cut it the first time. After many hours, as you can see, it's nighttime in this clip of just messing with the sleeve. This is what I ended up with. And these are the rest of the bodice pieces and the sleeve and the cuff that I will be transferring to my shell fabric. Also, please let me know if you know, but I feel like the sleeve comes too far forward into the bust. Anyway, after thinking about it, I decided I needed some sort of breathability in this garment, so I modified my back piece to accommodate a 1.5 to 2 inch shirred panel in the center back. Next, I'm just removing all those little extra bits of fabric around each panel and repeating for all of the pieces. These are all of my muslin pieces for the bodice and the sleeve. Then I traced everything and gave a 1/2 inch seam allowance to every seam unless otherwise noted, cutting them out with my rotary cutter that I have designated for paper use only. And these are all my pattern pieces. If there's one thing you should know about me or this channel, it's that I love to recycle old garments. So I'm just laying out my pieces to figure out exactly how many shirts I needed to go pick up to be able to complete this piece. And luckily, I found 3 of the exact same Brooks Brothers men's dress shirts. Each of these pattern pieces is attached to 2 panels, so there's 2 layers of fabric underneath, because I need 2 sets of the shell fabric and 2 sets of pattern pieces for the lining. So basically 4 of each pattern piece, excluding these sleeves, since those don't have linings. Laid out here are all of the bodice pieces, and I have 2 of each piece shown, with the exception of the plackets and the back shirred piece, because I end up replacing that back shirred panel with just a plain rectangle. And here are my sleeves. I also recut the cuffs to be cut on the fold instead of having them be 2 separate pieces. So to start construction, the first 3 pieces I'm connecting are going to be the front side, underbust left, and the left cup. We're connecting the front side and the underbust left together first, pinning it together and then sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. After pressing my seam flat, I'm then attaching my left cup to the bottom section. So I do make notches in this piece at the bottom within the seam allowance, so within 1/2 inch, because I need to manipulate the curve to fit the curve of the bottom section. My pieces are right sides together, of course, and then I'm pinning along the top and sewing that again at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once those pieces are sewn together, I'm then going through and continuing to cut those notches all the way through to the other side of the fabric. This will also help the curve sit flatter once it's pressed. Our next pieces are going to be the underbust right and the right cup. I'm repeating the same process by cutting notches within my seam allowance within 1/2 inch and using that to manipulate it to fit the curve of the right underbust. Pinning along and then sewing again at a 1/2 inch. I am of course going to continue cutting those notches through to the other side and then press that seam in one direction. Next, I'm connecting the front left to the front right. I'm just pinning it and sewing it a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I do cut just under 1/2 inch seam allowance at the top here because I want to press the seam a certain direction. I'm cutting my notches so that my curve lays flat, and then I'm cutting again within a 1/2 inch seam allowance at the bottom of the bust, because I'm pressing that seam flat and the other seam over to one side. Next steps are then sewing the back middle to the back side, right sides together, pinning it, and then sewing at a 1/2 inch. And after I finish sewing, I'm going to press that seam open flat. Next, I just need to attach the back piece to the front piece. Right sides together, pinning it and sewing it at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And my last step is just connecting the placket to the bodice, sewing right sides together at a 1/2 inch. The placket is on a fold so that it can be attached to the lining piece. And I also interfaced it since there's going to be tension from that front closure. But that's the gist of the bodice. I repeat this 3 more times so that I have 2 shell pieces and 2 lining pieces for each side of the top. And now to attach the lining to the shell piece, I'm just sewing right sides together along the placket and the inside edge of the lining at a 1/2 inch, of course. For the sleeve, since I don't have a lining, I'm sewing it with a French seam. My seam allowance is still in 1/2 inch, and my French seam looks something like this. Next came the challenge of attaching the cuff to the sleeve. So I'm starting by marking the quarters on my sleeve because my cuff opening, that slit opening, is going to be 1/4 from the seam, so the seams are not going to line up, so I wanted to make sure that they were even on both sides. So here I'm just pinning and then marking with a marker, and then folding my cuff piece in half and marking the center of the piece there. Since my design had a gathered sleeve, I'm sewing a row of basting stitches to be able to gather the fabric before attaching the cuff. 2 rows is always recommended, but I only used 1. And here I am gathering and distributing the gathers evenly. Once I was happy with the gathers, I then pinned the cuff to the sleeve and sewed it at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, leaving 1/2 inch tabs at the edge of my cuff. I will link the resource I used down below that explains this much better than I can. Once it was sewn together, I folded it up, folded under the 1/2 inch seam allowance, and slip stitched it from the inside. After the sleeve was complete, it was time to attach the sleeve to the bodice. Here I'm pinning right sides together all around the armhole and then sewing it a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then this was the tricky part since I don't have a sleeve lining, but I essentially brought the sleeve inside out and pulled it through the armhole of the lining fabric. And once everything was lined up, I began pinning the matching seams around the armhole together, essentially creating a sandwich of shell fabric, sleeve fabric, lining fabric. For the sake of continuity, I want to explain that I folded my neckline under a 1/2 inch and top stitched, which was not necessary because I end up adding bias tape all around the neckline and the hem. But you can see here I messily top stitched everything underneath. To prepare for adding boning channels, I went back through it and pressed all my seams flat. I also cut everything down to a 1/4 inch. And then to make some bone casings, I used strips of muslin at about 1 inch in width and some polyester boning to go inside. I'll link down below the boning that I used. I got it off Amazon, a pretty big spool for not very much money. So if you're a beginner in boning like me, this might be a good option for you. And to make the actual channel, I just sewed 2 rows of parallel stitching. Inside the bone casing, I made sure to round off the edges of the boning so it wouldn't poke through, and repeated that process for all the lengths of boning I needed to cover all of these seams. As I mentioned before, I finished off the neckline and the hem with some bias tape, which I just cut out of some extra scraps from my shirt, making sure to cut them on the bias so that they actually fit nicely over curves and corners. I'm prepping the tape by ironing 2 tabs and then folding in half. And once that was attached, I moved on to the back shirt panel. As I said, I just made a rectangle that had an extra inch at the top and bottom to make fold over hems to complete the neckline and the hemline. So to begin, I am folding 1/2 inch and then folding 1/2 inch again on both the top and the bottom and top stitching that down before moving on to my elastic thread to start shirring. For my shirring, I just went along in parallel rows about 1/2 inch apart from each other until I hit the bottom of the rectangle. And that's about it. For simplicity, I just attached the piece at a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then serged the raw edges. And the last step is just moving on to attaching the hook and eye closures down the front by hand. I measured 1/2 inch from the top and then placed the hook and eyes every 3/4 inch until I reached the bottom, so there were 11 or 12 sets total. This is what they look like from the inside. And that's it. Here is the finished corset-inspired top.
So casually keep diving into concrete, so bittersweet, keep losing sleep while driving in the backseat, left a